Long before a single foreign ship ever touched this coastline, Africa was already a continent of kingdoms, of gold, of scholars, of empires that rivaled anything in Europe or Asia at the time. This is the story of what happened after that, of trade that turned into conquest, of a line drawn on a map in a room 4,000 miles away that still shapes the borders of nations today, of wars that followed independence and some that are still being fought right now. This isn't a story about a continent that has only ever known violence. It's the story of specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments in time, decisions whose consequences are still being paid for today by real people in real places you'll hear named throughout this video. So let's go back to the very beginning, before the slave ships, before the borders, before any of it, to a continent that, for most of its history, answered to no one but itself. In the 14th century, the wealthiest man the world had ever recorded was not a European king. He was Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire, a kingdom that stretched across West Africa, built on control of the region's gold and salt trade. In 1324, Musa traveled to Mecca with a caravan reportedly numbering in the tens of thousands, including soldiers, officials, and enslaved attendants, along with camels carrying gold. Historians say he single-handedly disrupted the price of gold across the Mediterranean for over a decade, simply by giving so much of it away in cities along his route. Cairo's markets, by some accounts, took 12 years to recover. Mali itself had grown out of an earlier empire, Ghana, which controlled trans-Saharan trade routes from roughly the 8th century, and would later be succeeded by an even larger power, the Songhai Empire, which by the 16th century stretched over 1.4 million square kilometers, administered through a system of governors, tax collectors, and a standing army. To the east, along the Swahili coast, a string of city-states, Kilwa, Mombasa, Malindi, Zanzibar, grew wealthy on trade with Arabia, Persia, India, and even China. Chinese porcelain and coins have been excavated at archaeological sites along this coast, evidence of trade networks stretching thousands of miles. Kilwa, at its height in the 14th century, was described by the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta as one of the most beautiful cities he had seen anywhere in the world. To the south, the stone city of Great Zimbabwe housed a population estimated between 10 and 18,000 people at its peak in the 13th and 14th centuries. Its walls, built from over 1 million granite blocks without any mortar, still stand today, giving the modern nation of Zimbabwe its name. In the highlands of the Horn of Africa, the Kingdom of Axum had minted its own gold, silver, and bronze coins as early as the 3rd century. One of only 4 civilizations in the ancient world confirmed to have done so, alongside Rome, Persia, and the Kushan Empire. Axum would later become one of the earliest states in the world to adopt Christianity as an official religion in the 4th century, decades before Rome did. Political power in pre-colonial Africa was also, in a number of documented cases, held directly by women. In the Kingdom of Ndongo and later Matamba, in what is now Angola, a succession of women rulers governed for generations. Further south, the Lozi Kingdom and several other Central African states recognized dual rulership structures in which a queen mother held authority equal to or independent of a king. And across the Asante Empire, the position of queen mother, or Ohema, carried the constitutional power to select, and if necessary depose, the king himself, a structural check on royal authority with few direct parallels in contemporary European monarchies of the same era. Even further back, along the Nile south of Egypt, the Kingdom of Kush ruled over Egypt itself as its 25th dynasty for roughly a century, beginning around 744 BCE, and outlasted pharaonic Egypt entirely, continuing as an independent civilization for another 1,000 years afterward, centered at Meroe, where its rulers built more pyramids, smaller but more numerous than the Egyptians ever did. This is a civilization frequently omitted from popular retellings of ancient history, despite direct textual and archaeological evidence of its power and longevity. And in Timbuktu, a city on the edge of the Sahara, scholars gathered at Sankore University to study astronomy, law, theology, and medicine. At its height in the 16th century, The city is estimated to have housed between 150 and 180 manuscript libraries, some privately owned by wealthy merchant families, containing works on subjects ranging from mathematics to poetry. Many of these manuscripts survive today and are still being cataloged and translated. Further south and west, the Kingdom of Benin, in what is now Nigeria, developed one of the most sophisticated bronze casting traditions in the world. Portuguese visitors in the 15th century described Benin City as larger and better organized than many contemporary European cities, protected by an extraordinary system of earthen walls and ditches that, by some modern estimates, stretched for over 16,000 kilometers in total across the region. None of this is to say the continent was without conflict of its own. Kingdoms rose by conquering their neighbors. Empires fell to rivals from within, or to prolonged drought, or to the slow erosion of trade routes shifting elsewhere. This was, in that sense, a continent like any other, dynamic, competitive, unequal in its own right, its history full of its own wars fought entirely on its own terms. In the Ethiopian highlands, the Zagwe dynasty, in the 12th and 13th centuries, commissioned 11 churches at Lalibela carved directly downward out of solid volcanic rock, structures that remain active places of worship today, roughly 8 centuries later, and that UNESCO now recognizes as one of the most significant religious sites in the world. Ethiopia would go on to become the only African nation never formally colonized by a European power for an extended period, successfully defeating an invading Italian army at the Battle of Moe in 1896, a victory that became a symbol of anti-colonial resistance across the continent for generations afterward. Further west, the Kanem-Bornu Empire, centered around Lake Chad, endured for nearly 1,000 years, from roughly the 9th century into the 19th, controlling trans-Saharan trade routes and maintaining diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire. And along the coast of what is now Ghana, the Asante Empire, formally unified in 1701, would go on to build one of the most militarily formidable states in West Africa, organized around a sacred symbol of unity known as the Golden Stool. But it was a continent that governed itself. Its trade routes ran on its own terms, negotiated by its own rulers. Its wealth was, for the most part, its own to keep or to lose. That was about to change. Not overnight, but slowly, one ship at a time. In 1415, a Portuguese fleet captured the city of Ceuta on the North African coast. It was, in military terms, a minor victory. But it marked the beginning of a European presence on African shores that would not fully end for over 500 years. For the first several decades, the relationship was not one of conquest. It was one of trade, cautious, transactional, and often on African terms. Portuguese sailors, under the direction of Prince Henry the Navigator, pushed further down the West African coastline through the 1440s and 1450s, establishing trading posts rather than colonies. They came for gold, for pepper, specifically a variety known in Europe as grains of paradise, and for ivory. Local rulers, who controlled access to the interior and to the caravan routes bringing goods from further inland, set the terms of most early exchanges. In 1482, the Portuguese built Elmina Castle on the coast of what is now Ghana. Initially conceived purely as a trading post for gold, giving the surrounding coastline its European name, the Gold Coast. For its first decades, Elmina functioned largely as its name suggests, a mine, not a prison. That would change. The Kingdom of Congo, in what is now Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo, is perhaps the clearest case study in how this first contact unfolded, because so much of the correspondence between its rulers and Portugal survives. In 1483, Portuguese explorer Diogo Cao arrived at the mouth of the Congo River and was received not as a conqueror, but as a diplomatic curiosity and an opportunity. King Zinga, a Nokuwu converted to Christianity, took the baptismal name João and began exchanging ambassadors with the Portuguese crown as an equal sovereign. His son, who succeeded him and ruled as Afonso I from 1509 to 1543, corresponded directly and extensively with the King of Portugal, requesting missionaries, craftsmen, printing presses, and firearms, and sending his own son, Henrique, to study in Portugal, where he was later ordained as the first black Catholic bishop in modern history in 1518. But within that same relationship, something else was already beginning. Portuguese traders on the ground, operating largely outside royal oversight, were bypassing the king's authority, buying captives directly from local intermediaries to sell into the emerging plantation economy on São Tomé and other Atlantic islands off the coast. Islands that would themselves become an early testing ground for the sugar and slave plantation model later exported to Brazil and the Caribbean. Afonso wrote to the Portuguese crown repeatedly through the 1520s, describing a trade spiraling beyond his control, in which even members of his own court and extended family were being kidnapped and sold. In one surviving letter, he describes the country as being depopulated by the trade and pleads for it to be restricted to goods alone. Portugal's response was, in practice, to continue supplying the traders regardless. This is the hinge point historians return to again and again. The moment a trading relationship between nominal equals began to bend, quietly and then decisively, into something else entirely. Not through outright invasion. Not yet. But through the steady, compounding pressure of a trade that one side needed less than the other, and that generated profit too large for either side to fully restrain. Further south, in 1571, Portugal formally declared Angola a colony to be conquered by force rather than negotiated with, a shift in policy that marked a turning point across the region. Where Congo had been approached through diplomacy, Angola would be approached through direct military campaigns, driven almost entirely by demand for captives to supply Portuguese Brazil. This military approach met fierce resistance for decades. Queen Nzinga Mbande of the neighboring kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba led a sustained campaign against Portuguese expansion for nearly 40 years, from the 1620s until her death in 1663, at times allying with the Dutch against Portugal, and remains one of the most studied examples of African resistance leadership from this early contact period. A reminder that the transition from trade to conquest was neither quick nor uncontested. By the early 1500s, the gold and ivory that had first drawn European ships to this coast had not disappeared. But they were being eclipsed, year by year, decade by decade, by a different kind of cargo, one that would come to define the relationship between two continents for the next 350 years, and whose scale would eventually dwarf every trade that had come before it. Not every early conquest was driven by the slave trade specifically. In 1897, a British force launched what became known as the Benin Punitive Expedition, officially in retaliation for the killing of a British delegation that had attempted to enter the Kingdom of Benin during a religious festival closed to outsiders. British troops burned Benin City and looted thousands of the kingdom's bronze plaques and ivory sculptures, the same bronzes described earlier for their sophistication, dispersing them into museums and private collections across Europe, where a large portion remain today, the subject of an ongoing international repatriation debate that has intensified significantly in recent years, with Germany returning a number of pieces to Nigeria beginning in 2022. That is where we turn next. Before the Atlantic slave trade reached its full scale, two older systems of forced human trafficking already moved people across and out of Africa. Understanding them matters, not to diminish what came after, but because they shaped the networks, the routes, and in some cases the participants that the Atlantic trade would later draw upon. The trans-Saharan slave trade moved captive Africans north, across the desert, into North Africa and the Middle East, for well over 1,000 years, from roughly the 7th century onward. Caravans carried captives alongside gold and salt through cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Fez. Historians estimate it displaced somewhere between 6 and 10 million people over its lifespan, a majority of them women and children, many forced into domestic servitude, military service, or, in the case of some young boys, castration for service in royal courts, a practice with a mortality rate historians estimate as extremely high. The Indian Ocean slave trade moved people east, along Swahili coast trading networks, into Arabia, Persia, and India, running for a comparable span of centuries. The island of Zanzibar became one of its largest hubs. By the 19th century, its slave market was among the busiest in the world, and it was not formally abolished there until 1897, decades after Britain had abolished its own Atlantic trade. Both of these systems, while devastating in scale and duration, differed from what came next. In the industrial scale concentrated over a shorter span of centuries, and in the specific economic system of plantation agriculture it would come to feed. The Atlantic slave trade began in earnest in the early 1500s and accelerated for the next 3 centuries, peaking in the 1700s. Its purpose was singular: to supply forced labor for plantation economies in the Americas, sugar in Brazil and the Caribbean, tobacco in Virginia, and later cotton across the American South following the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, which dramatically increased demand for enslaved labor rather than reducing it. The numbers are difficult to hold in the mind. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, compiled from thousands of ship manifests and voyage records, puts the total number of Africans forced onto slave ships at over 12.5 million people between the 16th and 19th centuries. Of those, an estimated 10.7 million survived the crossing to disembark in the Americas. The remainder, roughly 1.8 million people, died during the Middle Passage itself, from disease, malnutrition, suffocation in overcrowded holds, or suicide. The journey became known as the Middle Passage, the middle leg of a 3-part trade route. Ships left European ports carrying manufactured goods, textiles, alcohol, and firearms. They arrived on the West African coast and traded those goods for captives, a process that at major ports could take weeks or months as ships waited to fill their holds. Those captives were then carried across the Atlantic, a crossing that typically lasted between 6 and 11 weeks depending on winds and destination. The ships then returned to Europe loaded with sugar, cotton, tobacco, and rum, completing what historians call the triangular trade, a system that generated enormous profit at every stage of the journey except for the people held inside it. Along the West African coast, dozens of fortified trading posts, originally built for gold, were repurposed or expanded specifically to hold captives before their crossing. Elmina Castle, first built by the Portuguese in 1482 and seized by the Dutch in 1637, held as many as 1,000 people at a time in its dungeons, men held separately from women, in chambers with almost no ventilation, awaiting ships that might not arrive for weeks. A small window in one dungeon, still visible today, is known as the Door of No Return. Cape Coast Castle, roughly 10 kilometers away and controlled at various points by the Swedish, Danish, Dutch, and finally British, operated on a similar model and is estimated to have processed hundreds of thousands of captives over its 2 centuries of operation. The trade's geography shifted considerably over its 3.5 centuries. In its earliest phase, through the 1500s, Portuguese traders drew primarily from the Kongo and Angola regions of West Central Africa. By the peak trading decades of the 1700s, the center of activity had shifted to the Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra in what is now Nigeria and Benin, and to the Gold Coast itself, as British, French, and Dutch traders competed directly for access to inland kingdoms and the captives their wars and raids produced. Senegambia, further north, supplied a comparatively smaller but steady share across nearly the entire period, in part because its proximity to Europe made it one of the first regions drawn into the trade and one of the last to see it fully end. On Gorée Island, off the coast of modern Senegal, a narrow doorway facing the ocean has become one of the most visited memorial sites in the world, a physical threshold that an unknown but significant number of people passed through, never to return to the continent. Resistance occurred at every stage of this system. Historians have documented several hundred shipboard rebellions across the era of the trade, though most were suppressed with extreme violence, and captives who survived the crossing continued to resist through escape, work slowdowns, and, in several documented cases, large-scale uprisings, including the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739 and, most significantly, the Haitian Revolution beginning in 1791, in which enslaved and formerly enslaved people overthrew French colonial rule entirely and established the first black-led republic in the Americas, an event that sent shockwaves through every slaveholding society in the hemisphere and directly influenced the timing of Britain's own abolitionist debates in the years that followed. This trade did not happen without African participation, a fact that complicates, but does not excuse, the system as a whole. Some coastal kingdoms and merchant networks captured and sold war captives, debtors, or convicted criminals to European traders, profiting from a system that provided firearms and manufactured goods in return, and which in some cases fundamentally reshaped local warfare, as access to European guns became a strategic necessity for survival. The Kingdom of Dahomey, in what is now Benin, built substantial wealth and a formidable military, including the Agoji, an elite corps of female warriors, largely on revenue from this trade throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The Asante Empire, in what is now Ghana, similarly expanded its territory and wealth partly through control of trade routes feeding the coastal forts. But it is essential to understand the asymmetry underneath that participation. European demand created and sustained the market at a scale no prior system had approached. European ships, capital, and firearms escalated the violence needed to supply it, often destabilizing entire regions and drawing previously peaceful societies into a cycle of raiding and counter-raiding simply to avoid becoming targets themselves. And it was overwhelmingly European and American colonial economies, not African societies, that accumulated the long-term wealth this system generated. Wealth that historians credit with helping fund the early stages of Europe's Industrial Revolution. The demographic impact on the African continent was severe and long-lasting. Some economic historians, notably Nathan Nunn in widely cited research published in the 2000s, have found a strong statistical correlation between the regions of Africa that supplied the most captives to the slave trades and those same regions' lower levels of economic development today. A correlation Nunn attributes partly to the trade's role in weakening pre-existing political and social structures across the affected areas. Other historians dispute the precise mechanisms but broadly agree the trade's economic and demographic toll was severe and multi-generational. Brazil alone received an estimated 4.8 million enslaved Africans over the course of the trade, nearly 40% of the entire Atlantic total, and roughly 10 times the number who arrived in the territory that became the United States. This is a fact often underappreciated outside Brazil itself, where the legacy of that history remains deeply embedded in the country's demographics and culture today. Brazil has the largest population of African descent of any country outside Africa itself. The Caribbean, driven overwhelmingly by sugar cultivation, among the most physically brutal forms of plantation labor, with mortality rates so severe that most Caribbean plantations depended on continuous new arrivals rather than natural population growth to sustain their enslaved workforce, received a further several million. Britain formally abolished the Atlantic slave trade in 1807, followed by the United States in 1808, though enforcement was inconsistent for decades and illegal trafficking continued well after. Slavery itself, as opposed to the trade in new captives, persisted far longer, until 1833 in most of the British Empire, 1848 in French colonies, 1865 in the United States, and not until 1888 in Brazil, the last country in the Americas to abolish it. The movement to end the trade was driven substantially by formerly enslaved people themselves. Olaudah Equiano, kidnapped as a child from what is now Nigeria, purchased his own freedom in 1766 and later published a widely read autobiography in 1789 describing the Middle Passage in detail, a book that became one of the most influential texts of the British abolitionist movement. Freed and escaped people across the Americas and Britain organized, testified before parliamentary committees, and built the political pressure that eventually forced legislative change, alongside British abolitionist politicians such as William Wilberforce, who introduced anti-slave trade bills to Parliament for nearly 2 decades before the 1807 Act finally passed. But the abolition of the slave trade did not mean Europe's interest in Africa ended. It meant that interest changed shape. What Europe had once extracted in human bodies, it now began to extract more directly in land, minerals, and labor, administered not from a ship's hold, but from a colonial office. And in 1884, the powers of Europe would sit down at a conference table in Berlin to formalize, on paper and with rulers laid across a map, exactly how they intended to divide the entire remaining continent among themselves. In just over 40 years, the map of an entire continent was redrawn, not by the people living on it, but by delegates in a conference room in Berlin who, by most accounts, had never set foot there. In 1870, European powers formally controlled roughly 10% of the African continent, mostly coastal trading posts. By 1914, that figure had risen to over 90%. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 was convened by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck to establish rules for European powers competing over African territory, formalizing what became known as the Scramble for Africa. 14 nations attended. No African representatives were present or consulted. Over the course of roughly 3 months, delegates drew borders using rulers and rivers and lines of latitude as reference points. Borders that, in many cases, split unified ethnic and linguistic communities in two, while forcing rival or historically hostile groups together inside single colonial territories. Those borders, largely arbitrary, drawn without regard for the people living inside them, remain, with only minor adjustments, the international borders of African nations today. The Organization of African Unity formally agreed in 1964 to preserve these colonial-era borders rather than risk the instability of redrawing them, a decision still debated by historians and political scientists as either a pragmatic necessity or a missed opportunity. Many of the continent's later conflicts trace a direct line back to lines drawn in that room. Nowhere was the human cost of this new colonial order more severe or more thoroughly documented than in the Congo Free State, a territory roughly 76 times the size of Belgium itself, claimed not as a colony of the Belgian state, but as the personal private property of one man, King Leopold II. Leopold never once visited the territory he owned. He administered it from Brussels as a commercial enterprise, first extracting ivory, then, increasingly through the 1890s, rubber, to meet the booming global demand created by the invention of the pneumatic bicycle and automobile tire. To enforce rubber quotas, Leopold's private security force, the Force Publique, largely staffed by African conscripts under European officers, used forced labor, hostage-taking of women and children to compel village compliance, and, in cases of failure to meet quota, the severing of hands as proof to superiors that ammunition had not been wasted. Missionaries and a British consular official named Roger Casement documented and photographed these practices extensively, and their reports, published in Europe, helped trigger international outcry. Missionary photographer Alice Seeley Harris took some of the first photographs documenting these mutilations directly from survivors and their families, images that circulated widely in Europe and are credited by historians as among the earliest uses of photography as a tool of international human rights advocacy. Roger Casement's own 1904 report to the British government, based on first-hand investigation along the Congo River, described entire villages that had been destroyed for failing to meet rubber quotas and named specific colonial officials responsible for ordering mutilations, a level of documented specificity that made the report difficult for European governments to dismiss. Historians estimate that between 8 and 10 million people died in the Congo Free State between 1885 and 1908 through direct violence, starvation caused by the disruption of farming to meet rubber quotas, and disease spreading through a population weakened and displaced by the system Leopold built, a death toll representing roughly half the territory's estimated population. International pressure, amplified by figures such as the American writer Mark Twain, who wrote a scathing satirical pamphlet condemning Leopold's rule, and the Congo Reform Association, the first major international human rights campaign of its kind, eventually forced the Belgian parliament to annex the territory from Leopold directly in 1908, renaming it the Belgian Congo. The worst abuses of the personal rule era ended, though forced labor and colonial exploitation continued in modified form for another half-century. At almost exactly the same time, in German South-West Africa, modern-day Namibia, colonial forces carried out what many historians now recognize as the first genocide of the 20th century. In January 1904, after the Herero people rose up against German colonial rule, land seizures, and the mistreatment of their cattle herds, and were joined later that year by the Nama people, German General Lothar von Trotha issued what became known as the Vernichtungsbefehl, or extermination order, in October 1904, instructing his forces to kill any Herero man, woman, or child found within the colonies, borders, armed or not, and to shoot anyone attempting to surrender. Survivors were driven into the Omaheke section of the Kalahari Desert, where German forces poisoned or guarded the region's few waterholes, deliberately trapping fleeing families without water. Thousands who were captured rather than killed outright were instead sent to concentration camps, a term used explicitly in German colonial administrative records of the period, including one on Shark Island, off the Namibian coast, where death rates from starvation, disease, and forced labor are estimated to have exceeded 70% of those interned. By 1908, an estimated 65,000 of the roughly 80,000 Herero people and around 10,000 of an estimated 20,000 Nama people had been killed, a mortality rate of roughly 80% and 50% of each population, respectively. Germany formally acknowledged this history as genocide in 2021, more than a century later, and agreed to fund over €1 billion in development projects in Namibia over 30 years, though descendant communities and their legal representatives have criticized the agreement for being negotiated without their direct participation and for avoiding the term reparations specifically. Colonial violence was not confined to the earliest decades of conquest. It persisted, in different forms, into the 20th century's final act of empire, sometimes escalating even as decolonization elsewhere was already underway. In Kenya in the 1950s, the Mau Mau Uprising, a rebellion against British colonial rule, land dispossession, and the seizure of the most fertile highland farmland for white settlers, led primarily, though not exclusively by the Kikuyu people, was met with a British counterinsurgency campaign that declared a state of emergency in 1952 and lasted 8 years. It included a network of detention camps holding an estimated 150,000 to over 1 million Kenyans, depending on the source and definition used, under conditions detainees described as involving systematic torture, forced labor, sexual violence, and killings, documented in later historical research by scholars including Caroline Elkins. Britain formally acknowledged this history in 2013, following a landmark legal case brought by a small group of elderly Kenyan survivors, expressing regret and paying compensation to more than 5,000 claimants, though the settlement covered only a fraction of those who historians estimate were affected. In southern Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe, colonial land policy took a particularly stark form. The Land Apportionment Act of 1930 formally reserved roughly half the colony's land, generally its most fertile, for a white settler population that numbered barely 5% of the total, forcing the black majority onto smaller, less productive reserves. This land imbalance would remain largely unresolved through Rhodesia's period as a self-governing British colony, through a white minority government's unilateral declaration of independence from Britain in 1965, explicitly intended to preserve white minority rule, through the Rhodesian Bush War of the 1970s that eventually forced a negotiated transition, and into independent Zimbabwe itself in 1980, where the land question would resurface decades later, in the early 2000s, through a controversial and often violent land redistribution program under President Robert Mugabe that devastated the country's commercial agricultural output and contributed to a period of extreme hyperinflation. In British-controlled territories, a governing philosophy known as indirect rule, pioneered by colonial administrator Frederick Lugard in Nigeria and later applied across much of British Africa, worked by co-opting existing local rulers and chieftaincy structures into the colonial administrative hierarchy, a system that was, in places, less immediately violent than direct rule, but which historians argue often deepened ethnic divisions by hardening flexible pre-colonial identities into fixed administrative categories, entrenching some rulers' authority over others in ways that would later fuel post-independence conflict, a pattern that echoes directly into the identity card system later used in Rwanda, which this story returns to shortly. In Kenya specifically, the designation of the fertile Central Highlands as a White Highlands, reserved exclusively for European settlement, displaced tens of thousands of Kikuyu farmers from ancestral land beginning in the early 1900s, a grievance that would remain a central, unresolved driver of the Mau Mau uprising decades later. Across the continent, from French West Africa to Portuguese Angola and Mozambique, to Belgian Congo to British-controlled Rhodesia, the pattern repeated with local variation. Forced labor systems, including France's notorious travail forcé, which conscripted African labor for infrastructure projects like the Congo Ocean Railway, where an estimated 14,000 workers are believed to have died during its construction in the late 1920s. Cash crop mandates that displaced subsistence farming and contributed to periodic famine. The suppression of local languages and religious and cultural practice in colonial schools, and administrative and legal structures designed from the outset to extract resources and labor rather than build institutions that would serve the people living under them. In French Equatorial Africa, encompassing modern-day Gabon, Congo-Brazzaville, Chad, and the Central African Republic, colonial administration in the early 20th century was largely outsourced to private concession companies operating under a system closely modeled on Leopold's Congo, granted monopoly rights to extract rubber and ivory in exchange for a share of profits paid to the French state, with minimal oversight of how that extraction was enforced on the ground. French journalist and writer André Gide, after touring the region in 1925 and 1926, published an account exposing forced labor conditions there that shocked French public opinion in ways comparable to the earlier Congo Free State revelations, though the reforms that followed were limited and slow. In Italian-controlled Libya, colonial forces under Benito Mussolini's fascist government waged a brutal pacification campaign against Bedouin resistance in Cyrenaica through the late 1920s and early 1930s, led by General Rodolfo Graziani. Tens of thousands of Libyans were forcibly interned in concentration camps in the desert, where disease and starvation killed a substantial share of those held. Historians estimate the campaign, combined with earlier phases of Italian conquest beginning in 1911, may have killed as much as a quarter of the entire population of Cyrenaica. And on the island of Madagascar, a 1947 uprising against French colonial rule was suppressed with a level of violence that shocked even some French officials at the time, involving mass executions, torture, and the killing of prisoners by being thrown from aircraft, a practice French authorities themselves referred to in internal correspondence. French government estimates at the time claimed roughly 11,000 deaths. More recent historical research suggests the true toll may have been significantly higher, possibly in the tens of thousands, making it one of the deadliest instances of colonial repression of the post-war era, largely overlooked in wider historical memory compared to contemporaneous events elsewhere. By the middle of the 20th century, that extraction had built a deep well of resentment and, following two world wars that had exhausted the colonial powers themselves, drawn hundreds of thousands of African soldiers into fighting on their behalf, and undermined their claims to moral authority, a growing belief across the continent that independence was not just possible, but overdue. The fight to win it back would not be uniform. In some territories, it would come through negotiation, sometimes remarkably swift. In others, it would come only through years, and in some cases decades, of war. Between 1957 and 1966, more than 30 African nations gained independence from European colonial rule, in a wave so rapid that 1960 alone became known as the Year of Africa, with 17 countries declaring independence within 12 months. For some, the transition was largely peaceful, negotiated at conference tables not unlike the one in Berlin decades earlier, though this time with African leaders present. For others, independence came only after years of armed struggle and staggering loss of life. In Algeria, an 8-year war against French colonial rule, beginning with a coordinated series of attacks in November 1954, became one of the 20th century's most brutal independence conflicts. Algeria had a particularly entrenched colonial relationship, annexed by France in 1830, and legally treated not as a colony but as an integral part of France itself, home to over 1 million European settlers known as Pieds Noirs. French forces employed widespread torture, including a technique known as the gaijin, using electrical current, forced population relocation of an estimated 2 million rural Algerians into guarded camps, and reprisal killings against suspected insurgents and civilians alike. Historians' estimates of Algerian deaths vary widely, from the low hundreds of thousands cited by French sources to over 1 million claimed by the Algerian government, a discrepancy that remains politically contested to this day. Algeria won its independence in 1962, following a referendum in which over 99% of participating Algerian voters supported it. The transition itself triggered a further wave of violence and mass departure. An estimated 800,000 to 900,000 Pieds Noirs left Algeria for France within months of independence, while a paramilitary group of French settlers and soldiers opposed to independence, the OAS, carried out a bombing and assassination campaign in a failed attempt to prevent the transition, including at least one attempt on the life of French President Charles de Gaulle himself for negotiating Algerian independence in the first place. Not every transition followed the pattern of prolonged war. Ghana, in 1957, became the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence from colonial rule, achieved primarily through sustained political organizing and strikes led by Kwame Nkrumah rather than armed insurgency, and Nkrumah's declaration that the independence of Ghana was meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent became a rallying statement. Independence movements across the continent that followed. Kenya, following the suppression of the Mau Mau uprising, ultimately achieved independence through negotiation in 1963, with Jomo Kenyatta, once imprisoned by British authorities on charges of managing the very uprising he had publicly distanced himself from, becoming the country's first prime minister and later president. But not every negotiated path avoided bloodshed entirely, and in Portuguese Guinea-Bissau, independence leader Amilcar Cabral built one of the most effective guerrilla movements of the era, developing schools and health clinics in rebel-held territory even while fighting Portuguese forces, only to be assassinated in January 1973, months before Guinea-Bissau's independence was formally achieved, a reminder that even successful liberation struggles often did not allow their architects to see the outcome. Portugal, under the authoritarian Estado Novo regime, led by Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, refused to grant independence to its African colonies, even as other European powers withdrew throughout the 1950s and 60s, officially reclassifying them as overseas provinces rather than colonies in an attempt to sidestep growing international pressure at the United Nations. This triggered prolonged wars in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, collectively known as the Portuguese Colonial War, running from 1961 into the mid-1970s and costing an estimated 100,000 lives across the three territories combined. The wars only ended after a military coup in Portugal itself. The Carnation Revolution of April 1974 brought a government willing to negotiate rapid withdrawal. In several of these territories, the end of colonial war did not bring peace. It brought civil war instead, as rival independence factions, often armed and funded by opposing sides of the Cold War, with the Soviet Union and Cuba backing one faction and the United States and apartheid South Africa backing another, turned on each other for control of the newly sovereign state. Angola's civil war, beginning almost immediately after independence in November 1975, would continue with intermittent ceasefires for 27 years until 2002, killing an estimated 500,000 people and displacing over 4 million. At its height, this conflict drew in tens of thousands of Cuban troops, deployed at the Angolan government's request beginning in 1975 in what became Cuba's largest overseas military deployment of the entire Cold War, while apartheidized South Africa launched repeated cross-border military incursions of its own, both to support Angolan rebel forces and to strike at bases used by Namibian independence fighters, still resisting South African occupation of their own territory. The two conflicts, Angola's civil war and Namibia's own decades-long war for independence from South African rule, which finally succeeded in 1990, became so intertwined that historians frequently treat them as a single regional conflict rather than two separate wars. And in the Congo, the same territory once ruled as Leopold's personal property, independence arrived on June 30, 1960, following a colonial transition widely criticized by historians as rushed and poorly prepared, with almost no Congolese citizens having held senior administrative or military positions under Belgian rule. Political crisis followed within days. Patrice Lumumba, the country's first democratically elected prime minister, was removed from power within months amid a secessionist crisis in the mineral-rich Katanga province, and in January 1961, assassinated by firing squad with the direct involvement of Belgian officials on the ground and covert support from the American Central Intelligence Agency, which viewed his government as a Cold War risk, given his nationalist rhetoric and outreach to the Soviet Union. Declassified documents released decades later, including a Belgian parliamentary inquiry in 2001, confirmed the extent of that foreign involvement. Lumumba's death set the stage for the rise of Joseph Mobutu, later Mobutu Sese Seko, who seized power in a coup in 1965 and ruled the country, renamed Zaire in 1971, as a dictator for the next 32 years, backed for much of that time by Western governments, including the United States, who valued his firmly anti-communist alignment far more than the character of his increasingly corrupt and authoritarian rule, under which he is estimated to have personally embezzled billions of dollars in state resources. This is the pattern that recurs across the continent's independence era. The fight to remove a colonial power was, again and again, followed not by stability, but by a second struggle, this time over who would inherit the state that colonialism had built, and on whose terms, often with outside Cold War powers treating African nations as proxy battlegrounds rather than sovereign states in their own right. Borders drawn in Berlin. Institutions built for extraction, not governance. Rival factions armed by outside powers fighting a global Cold War through African intermediaries. These were the conditions independence was born into, across dozens of nations simultaneously. What followed, in the decades after, were some of the deadliest conflicts of the 20th century. In May 1967, the southeastern region of Nigeria, dominated by the Igbo ethnic group, declared independence as the Republic of Biafra, following a military coup, a counter-coup, and a wave of ethnic violence in 1966 in which tens of thousands of Igbo people living in northern Nigeria were killed, prompting an estimated 1 million to flee back to the southeast. The Nigerian federal government, determined to prevent secession and preserve control over the region's oil reserves, responded with a full military campaign. The Nigerian Civil War lasted nearly 3 years, until January 1970. The Nigerian military imposed a blockade on Biafra, cutting off food and medical supplies to the breakaway region. The resulting famine became one of the first humanitarian crises to be extensively broadcast on international television, with images of severely malnourished children shocking global audiences and helping give rise to the modern humanitarian aid movement, including directly inspiring the founding of Médecins Sans Frontières in 1971 by doctors who had worked in Biafra. Estimates of the total death toll from combat, but overwhelmingly from starvation and related disease, range from 1 to 2 million people, the majority of them children. The war also became a notable Cold War proxy in miniature. Britain and the Soviet Union both supplied arms and support to the federal Nigerian government, largely to protect their respective oil interests and strategic relationships, while France provided covert support to Biafra, and a small number of other African nations, including Tanzania and Gabon, extended formal diplomatic recognition to the breakaway republic recognition Biafra's leadership had hoped, ultimately in vain, would translate into the broader international intervention needed to secure its survival as an independent state. In April 1994, in Rwanda, a plane carrying the country's president was shot down as it approached the capital, Kigali, triggering the fastest and most concentrated genocide of the 20th century. Over roughly 100 days, extremist members of the Hutu majority, organized through state radio broadcasts that explicitly called for killing, military and police structures, and civilian militias known as the Interahamwe, killed an estimated 800,000 people, the overwhelming majority ethnic Tutsis, along with moderate Hutus who opposed the killing or attempted to protect their neighbors. The roots of this division trace back, once again, to colonial policy. Belgian administrators, who took over the territory after Germany's defeat in the First World War, formalized and hardened what had previously been a more fluid social distinction between Hutu and Tutsi identities into fixed, biologically framed racial categories, issuing identity cards from 1933 onward that recorded ethnicity permanently, the same identity card system that would later make it possible. 6 decades on, for militia roadblocks to sort the population for killing with brutal efficiency. The killing was carried out largely with machetes and clubs, often by neighbors against neighbors, at a pace that outstripped even the industrialized killing of the Holocaust in terms of average daily death rate. Roadblocks were set up across the country to check identity cards, which under Belgian colonial-era policy had explicitly recorded ethnicity. The international community, including a United Nations peacekeeping mission already present in the country under Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, has been widely criticized in the decades since for failing to intervene despite clear and repeated advance warning. Dallaire himself had sent cables to UN headquarters months earlier warning of plans for mass killing. The genocide ended only when a rebel force, the Rwandan Patriotic Front led by Paul Kagame, invading from Uganda, took control of the capital in July 1994. Kagame has governed Rwanda in the decades since, first as vice president and later as president from 2000 onward, credited by many international observers for the country's remarkable economic recovery and low corruption relative to regional neighbors, while criticized by human rights organizations including Human Rights Watch for authoritarian control over political dissent and press freedom. The genocide's aftermath helped trigger what would become the deadliest conflict since the Second World War, as over 1 million Hutu refugees, including many perpetrators of the genocide, fled across the border into neighboring Zaire. The resulting instability, combined with the accelerating collapse of Mobutu's dictatorship, drew in armies from at least 8 African nations by the late 1990s. The First Congo War, from 1996 to 1997, saw Rwanda and Uganda back rebel leader Laurent Désiré Kabila in overthrowing Mobutu. The Second Congo War followed almost immediately, from 1998 to 2003, after Kabila's former allies turned against him, drawing in Zimbabwe, Angola, Namibia, and Chad on one side, and Rwanda and Uganda on the other, in what became known as Africa's World War, the largest interstate war in modern African history. Fighting was compounded and prolonged by the systematic exploitation of the country's exceptional mineral wealth: gold, diamonds, and increasingly coltan, a mineral essential to the capacitors used in mobile phones and other consumer electronics, global demand for which spiked sharply in the late 1990s. This gave many armed factions on all sides a direct financial incentive to prolong the conflict rather than resolve it, a dynamic researchers have termed a war economy. Estimates of the total death toll, dominated by disease and starvation resulting from the collapse of infrastructure, agriculture, and health systems rather than direct combat, range as high as 5.5 million people according to a series of mortality surveys conducted by the International Rescue Committee, making it by most measures the deadliest conflict anywhere in the world since 1945. Armed conflict and militia violence in the eastern Congo, tied directly to control of mineral resources, continues in some form to this day, more than 2 decades after the formal war's end. A formal peace agreement was signed in Pretoria in 2002, and the Second Congo War is generally considered to have ended in 2003 with a transitional power-sharing government, but more than 100 armed groups have continued to operate in the eastern provinces of North and South Kivu in the years since, including a resurgent rebel group known as M23, whose renewed offensive beginning in 2022 and continuing through the mid-2020s displaced hundreds of thousands of additional civilians and drew renewed accusations, documented by United Nations investigators, of direct support from the Rwandan government, allegations Rwanda has denied. The pattern that began with the genocide's refugee crisis in 1994, in other words, has never fully resolved. The mineral wealth driving this ongoing instability, coltan, cobalt, and gold in particular, has only grown more geopolitically significant with time, given the Congo's position as the source of a majority of the world's cobalt, a mineral essential to the rechargeable batteries used in smartphones and electric vehicles, linking the region's ongoing conflict directly to global consumer technology supply chains in ways researchers and journalists continue to investigate today. To the west, in Sierra Leone, a civil war beginning in March 1991, when the Revolutionary United Front invaded from neighboring Liberia, became globally infamous for a single practice: the deliberate amputation of civilians' hands, arms, and feet by rebel forces, used as a systematic tool of terror against a population accused of supporting the government, sometimes asking victims whether they wanted long sleeve or short sleeve before choosing where to cut. The war was financed substantially through the illicit trade of diamonds mined under forced labor, often by children, and smuggled out to be sold on international markets, so-called blood diamonds or conflict diamonds, a term and an industry crisis that later prompted the creation of the Kimberley Process in 2003, an international certification scheme intended to prevent conflict diamonds from reaching global markets, though its effectiveness has been repeatedly questioned by watchdog organizations including Global Witness, one of its own founding advocacy members, which withdrew its support in 2011, citing the scheme's failure to address ongoing abuses. The war lasted 11 years, ending in 2002 with the intervention of British troops and UN peacekeepers, and killed an estimated 50,000 people, displacing over 2 million more, roughly a third of the country's population at the time. Further south, a different system of organized violence operated on a different logic. From 1948, when the National Party won an all-white election on an explicit segregationist platform, until the early 1990s, South Africa's apartheid government enforced a comprehensive legal system of racial segregation and disenfranchisement against the country's black majority, who made up roughly 80% of the population but were confined to just 13% of the country's land under the system's homeland policy. The system was backed by police and military violence against resistance movements, forced removals of entire communities such as District 6 in Cape Town, and the imprisonment of leaders including Nelson Mandela, who was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1964 and spent 27 years in prison, 18 of them on Robben Island, before his release in February 1990. Apartheid ended through a negotiated transition rather than a full-scale civil war, culminating in South Africa's first fully democratic election in April 1994, in which Mandela was elected president, but not before decades of violent suppression, including the Sharpeville Massacre of 1960, in which police killed 69 unarmed protesters demonstrating against pass laws, and the Soweto Uprising of 1976, in which police killed an unknown number of protesting schoolchildren, estimated by some sources at well over 100, after students demonstrated against a policy mandating instruction in Afrikaans. Both massacres became international turning points, galvanizing a global anti-apartheid movement that eventually pressured most Western governments into economic sanctions against South Africa by the mid-1980s, sanctions the apartheid government's own later leadership cited as a significant factor in bringing it to the negotiating table alongside Mandela and the African National Congress in the early 1990s. And in the early 2000s, in the Darfur region of Western Sudan, a government-backed campaign against rebel groups that began in 2003 escalated into what the United States government formally characterized as genocide in 2004, the systematic killing, mass displacement, and widespread sexual violence carried out against non-Arab ethnic groups, including the Fur, Masalit, and Zaghawa peoples, by Sudanese government forces and allied Arab militias known as the Janjaweed. Estimates of the death toll range from roughly 200,000 to as high as 400,000 people, with over 2 million people displaced into camps within Sudan and across the border into Chad, many of which remained active decades later. In 2009, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir on charges, including genocide, the first such warrant ever issued against a sitting head of state, though al-Bashir remained in power for another decade, until being removed in a 2019 popular uprising and military intervention. Sudan's instability did not end there. In April 2023, a new civil war broke out between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, itself an outgrowth of the same Janjaweed militias responsible for the Darfur killings 2 decades earlier, triggering what the United Nations has since described as one of the largest displacement crises in the world, with over 10 million people forced from their homes. In Uganda, Idi Amin seized power in a 1971 military coup and ruled for 8 years, during which human rights organizations estimate his regime killed between 100,000 and 500,000 people through extrajudicial killings, purges of rival ethnic groups within the military, and the operation of secret detention and torture facilities. Amin's expulsion of the country's entire Asian minority population, roughly 80,000 people, many of them Ugandan-born business owners in 1972, devastated the national economy for years afterward. He was ultimately removed from power in 1979 following an invasion by Tanzanian forces responding to Amin's own attempted annexation of Tanzanian territory the previous year. In the Horn of Africa, a 30-year war for Eritrean independence from Ethiopia, beginning in 1961, became one of the longest-running armed conflicts on the continent, compounded through the 1980s by a catastrophic famine, partly driven by drought but significantly worsened by the policies of Ethiopia's Marxist Derg government, which restricted food aid to rebel-held famine areas for strategic reasons. The famine killed an estimated 400,000 to 1 million people and became, through extensive Western television coverage, one of the most globally recognized humanitarian crises of the 20th century, inspiring the 1985 Live Aid benefit concerts. Eritrea finally achieved independence in 1993, only for the two nations to fight a further border war between 1998 and 2000 that killed an additional estimated 70,000 people over what was, in places, only a few kilometers of contested territory. Mozambique, having only just won independence from Portugal in 1975, was almost immediately drawn into its own 16-year civil war between the ruling FRELIMO party and RENAMO rebels, a conflict heavily shaped by outside intervention from apartheid South Africa and white minority-ruled Rhodesia, both of which backed RENAMO as a proxy force against a government they viewed as a security threat. The war, lasting until a 1992 peace accord, killed an estimated 1 million people and displaced roughly 5 million more, and landmines planted during the conflict continued to kill and injure civilians for decades afterward, with Mozambique not declared fully mine-free until 2015. In Somalia, the collapse of Siad Barre's government in 1991 triggered a state collapse from which the country has never fully recovered, descending into clan-based warfare that, at its most internationally visible moment, drew a United States-led intervention in 1992 and 1993 intended to secure humanitarian aid deliveries during a severe famine. That intervention ended in the Battle of Mogadishu in October 1993, later depicted in the film Black Hawk Down, after which international forces largely withdrew, leaving factional conflict to continue for years, later compounded by the rise of the al-Qaeda-linked militant group al-Shabaab in the mid-2000s. In Liberia, founded in the 19th century by freed African-American settlers under a complicated legacy of its own, two successive civil wars between 1989 and 2003, involving warlord-turned-President Charles Taylor, killed an estimated 250,000 people and became notorious for the widespread use of child soldiers, some as young as 8 or 9 years old, conscripted by multiple factions throughout the conflict. Taylor was later convicted by a UN-backed special court in 2012 for war crimes committed not in Liberia itself, but for his role arming and directing RUF rebels during the neighboring war in Sierra Leone. In the Central African Republic, a 2013 coup by a mostly Muslim rebel coalition known as Seleka, followed by the rise of mostly Christian and animist self-defense militias called the Anti-Balaka, triggered a cycle of sectarian violence and reprisal killings that displaced roughly a quarter of the country's population and drew UN peacekeeping and French military intervention in a conflict researchers have again linked back to the same pattern of weak post-colonial state institutions and contested access to the country's diamond and gold resources. In Chad, a country born out of the same French Equatorial Africa system described earlier in this story, more than 3 decades of near-continuous coups, rebellions, and civil war followed independence in 1960, including a brutal 8-year dictatorship under Hissène Habré from 1982 to 1990, later convicted in 2016 by a special African Union-backed court, the first time an African Union court had ever tried a former head of state for human rights crimes committed in another African country, since Habré's trial was held in Senegal. Investigators documented an estimated 40,000 deaths and tens of thousands of cases of political imprisonment and torture under his rule. Largely carried out by a political police force, his government had built with support and training from Western intelligence agencies during the Cold War, who valued Habre's anti-Libyan alignment in the region. In Angola, even after its 27-year civil war formally ended in 2002 with the death of rebel leader Jonas Savimbi, the legacy of that conflict persisted in one of the highest concentrations of unexploded landmines anywhere in the world, a hazard that continued to kill and maim civilians, especially children, for decades afterward, and that international demining organizations estimate will not be fully cleared until well into the 2030s at current funding levels. Each of these conflicts had its own causes, its own local logic, and its own specific victims and perpetrators. They should not be flattened into a single story. But they share a common thread that runs back through this entire story. Colonial-era borders that did not reflect the people living inside them, institutions built to extract rather than govern, and resources, diamonds, coltan, gold, oil that too often gave outside and inside actors alike more incentive to prolong a war than to end one. In South Africa, after apartheid's end, the country chose an unusual path. Rather than pursuing widespread criminal prosecution, it established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1996, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, which invited perpetrators of politically motivated violence to testify publicly in exchange for amnesty from prosecution. It was an imperfect and deeply debated process, criticized by some victims' families as prioritizing reconciliation over justice, but credited by many historians with giving victims and their families a public record of what had happened to them and why, at a scale few other transitional justice processes have matched. In Rwanda, facing a judicial system with only a few hundred surviving trained lawyers and judges, overwhelmed by more than 120,000 genocide suspects awaiting trial, communities revived a traditional local justice system called Gakaka, trying an estimated 1.9 million cases at the village level between 2001 and 2012. This process was criticized by some international human rights observers for falling short of formal due process standards, but credited by others with helping the country's shattered communities rebuild some functioning basis for coexistence far faster than the formal court system could have managed alone. Some of this history's threads remain unresolved even now. Boko Haram, a militant group founded in northeastern Nigeria in 2002, escalated into a full insurgency by 2009, gaining international attention in 2014 with the kidnapping of 276 schoolgirls from the town of Chibok, and has since killed an estimated tens of thousands of people and displaced millions more across Nigeria, Chad, Niger, and Cameroon. Further west and north, a series of military coups across the Sahel region, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Guinea, all saw governments overthrown between 2020 and 2023, has been linked by many analysts to the same colonial era, border and governance legacies. This story has traced from the beginning, compounded by the spread of jihadist insurgencies, and, in some cases, the withdrawal of former colonial power. France's military presence, after decades of counterterrorism operations that many local populations came to resent. Today, the countries in this story are not defined solely by the histories we've just described. Rwanda has posted some of the fastest sustained economic growth rates on the continent since the genocide's end. Nigeria is home to Nollywood now, by volume of films produced annually, one of the largest film industries in the world. Kenya became a global pioneer in mobile banking technology through the M-Pesa system, launched in 2007, a model since studied and partially adopted by financial systems on other continents. Namibia and Germany continue to negotiate the terms of historical accountability for the Herero and Nama genocide, an unresolved conversation, but an ongoing one, with descendant communities continuing to press for direct participation in future settlements. More broadly, The question of reparations for the slave trade, for colonial era violence, for resource extraction whose profits so often never returned to the continent, remains one of the most contested and unresolved conversations connected to everything this story has covered. The African Union formally designated 2025 as its Year of Reparations, a largely symbolic gesture, but one reflecting how central the question has become in continental politics, even as governments in Europe and the Americas remain divided, and in many cases reluctant on what form any accounting might take, or whether one is owed at all. This account does not attempt to resolve that debate. It simply notes that the history behind it is not, for the people and nations still living with its consequences, a closed chapter. It would be a mistake, too, to read this history as a story of a continent that was only ever acted upon. Every chapter in this story also contains resistance. Nzinga's 4 decades of war against Portuguese conquest, the hundreds of documented shipboard rebellions during the Eobo Middle Passage, Ethiopia's victory at Adwa, the independence movements that ultimately outlasted every empire that tried to hold them, and the truth commissions and community courts that entire nations built from scratch to try to answer for what had happened to them. This history was done to people who, at every stage, pushed back against it, not always successfully, and never without enormous cost, but always. This has been one specific and difficult thread: the violence brought by trade, by conquest, by the wars that followed independence, and the conflicts still unresolved today over the resources and boundaries that history left behind. It is one true story among many that could be told about this continent, not the whole of it, and not the only lens through which 54 nations and well over 1 billion people should be understood. What all of it adds up to is this: a continent that was shaped again and again by outside decisions, but never simply defined by them. Every kingdom lost to conquest had first ruled itself for centuries. Every people forced into a war they didn't start eventually found a way to write the next chapter on their own terms. That's not a footnote to this history. It's the through line running underneath all of it. If this kind of deep historical storytelling is something you want more of, that's exactly what this channel is here for. A video like this takes an enormous amount of research, fact-checking, and time to put together properly. So if you learned something today, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop a like to help this reach more people. And let me know in the comments which part of this history hit you the hardest. I read every single one. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.